Iranaeus on Antichrist. What did Iranaeus teach regarding Antichrist? And why do Jesuit Futurist pastors insist on referencing Iranaeus to support their future Antichrist doctrine? Why do these confused pastors not reference any other early church leaders? In this video, I'll explore these questions. Firstly, it is important to understand Iranaeus in an historical context. Iranaeus lived from 130 AD to 202 AD. This was a period in history when Christians were mercilessly persecuted, tortured, and murdered by the Roman Caesars. Iranaeus was a pupil of Polycarp, who was a pupil of the Apostle John. Like John, Polycarp and Iranaeus maintained that the Roman Empire was holding back the revealing of Antichrist, and that whatever took the place of the Roman Empire would be Antichrist, and that would herald in the end of the age. Because of this, Jesuit Futurist pastors insist that Iranaeus taught their version of futurism. That is not true. Iranaeus lived when the Roman Empire was still going strong. Yet he, like many other Christians at that time, rightly or wrongly, believed that the end was near because of the extreme persecution that they were subjected to. In fact, many believed they were in tribulation, and it would get worse when Antichrist was revealed with the demise of the Roman Empire. Did Iranaeus have any idea that Caesarian Rome would be replaced by something characterized by popes, namely Papal Rome? No, he didn't. How could he? That hadn't happened yet. Still, he taught that whatever replaced Caesarian Rome would be the Antichrist, and that the end would come quickly. At no time did Iranaeus teach the Jesuit Futurist view that thousands of years would pass before Antichrist was revealed. Listeners can confirm this by reading Book 5, Chapter 26 of his landmark work, Against Heresies, where he states that John and Daniel predicted the dissolution of the Roman Empire, which will precede the end of the world and the eternal kingdom of Christ. All credible Bible scholars and historians agree that the Roman Empire faded into the Holy Roman Empire, or Papal Rome, ruled over by popes. Now it is important to recognize that Polycarp, who taught Iranaeus, was a pupil of the Apostle John. And John is the only writer in the New Testament who used the term Antichrist. And Polycarp in his writings stated that the withholder in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 was the Roman Empire, and he insisted that that was the doctrine Paul taught. Because of this, it is reasonable to suggest that Iranaeus in Book 5 of his work titled Against Heresies was referencing the very doctrine passed down from the Apostle John, and the same doctrine taught by Tertullian, Hippolytus, and Cyprian. Tertullian wrote in chapter 32 of his Apology, quote, "There is also another and greater necessity for our offering prayer in behalf of the emperors, nay, for the complete stability of the empire, and for Roman interests in general, for we know that a mighty shock pending over the whole earth, in fact, the very end of all things threatening dreadful woes, is only retarded by the continued existence of the Roman Empire. We have no desire then to be overtaken by these dire events, and in praying that their coming may be delayed, we are lending our aid to Rome's duration." And in his comments on 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, he wrote, "For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now hinders must hinder until he be taken out of the way. What obstacle is there but the Roman state, the falling away of which, by being scattered into 10 kingdoms, shall introduce Antichrist upon its own ruins? And then shall be revealed the wicked one, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming. Even him whose coming is after the working of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish." Tertullian lived from 155 to 240 AD and would have been familiar with Iranaeus, as they were contemporaries to some degree. Again, like Iranaeus, Tertullian did not know what the replacement of Caesarian Rome would be called, but he knew that the Roman Empire was holding back whatever was to be revealed, albeit Antichrist and Papal Rome as we now identify it. That's why he and the early church prayed for the stability of Caesarian Rome. Why else? Furthermore, the writings of Cyprian and Hippolytus reflect the same understanding. They all taught that Rome was the restrainer or withholder spoken of by Paul in 2 Thessalonians. This same understanding is declared in the writings of the post-Nicene church leaders like Cyril of Jerusalem, John Chrysostom, and Augustine of Hippo. All agreed that the Roman Empire and its Caesars were holding back the unveiling of Antichrist and his kingdom, and it would emerge from the Roman Empire. The listener may read this for themselves in Cyril's Catechetical Lectures, number 15, and in Chrysostom's Homilies on 2 Thessalonians, and in Augustine of Hippo's City of God, chapter 19. I don't have time to go through those writings in this video, but I suggest my listeners take the time to source those writings and read them and draw their own conclusions. Of course, we know that the early church leaders did not live to see the rise of Papal Rome, so they could not witness or report directly on its emergence. Yet their successors who lived during the dissolution of the Roman Empire and the emergence of Papal Rome made no bones about identifying Papal Rome as the successor to pagan Rome, and the very Antichrist that John prophesied in his epistles. Had Iranaeus lived to see the rise of Papal Rome, he would have surely identified the Antichrist as Papal Rome, as no other power emerged from the Roman Empire. Thus, that which restrained the rise of Antichrist could only be the Roman Empire and its Caesars, and that which took its place could be none other than the Holy Roman Empire, or Papal Rome. There is no other option. Why is it important to understand what Iranaeus taught about this? It is important because he is the only early church leader referenced by Jesuit Futurist pastors, who misrepresent Iranaeus in order to attempt to lend some credibility to their false gap theory and end-of-time revealing of Antichrist doctrines. To the contrary, Iranaeus expected that when Antichrist was unveiled with the demise of the Roman Empire, tribulation would follow, and then Christ would return. He anticipated that this could happen within his lifetime, or shortly thereafter. Conversely, misguided and historically unschooled futurist pastors fail to acknowledge that Iranaeus held the historicist view of the restrainer of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and that, unlike the Jesuit futurist pastors of today, he projected no gap of time before Antichrist was revealed, but insisted, like his contemporaries and those immediately after him, that as Caesarian Rome faded, Antichrist would emerge, then tribulation, and then the end of the age. Today, in retrospect, we know that Papal Rome emerged from pagan Rome, just as the early church leaders taught. But unlike them, we can look down the corridor of time and see that the emergence of Papal Rome and Antichrist did not immediately result in a 7-year tribulation period and the end of the age. That is a fact of history. Papal Rome and Antichrist still exist today in the form of the Vatican, the Roman Catholic Church, and the popes of Rome. That is the same entity that was gradually revealed when Caesarian Rome faded, and it is still in effect today. History confirms this. So if you are listening to Jesuit futurist pastors insisting that Antichrist is yet to be revealed, and that Iranaeus taught that doctrine, you are being misled by historically ignorant pastors. You also need to make a note that Jesuit futurist pastors reference no other early church leader, as those church leaders' writings make no allowance for twisting text to mean something else. These misguided pastors avoid referencing Iranaeus' contemporaries for this very reason. Simply, there is no support for their futurist doctrines to be found there. It is also important to note that Jesuit Futurist pastors, especially those who distance themselves from certain aspects of Schofield's dispensational soteriology, but not his eschatology. They find themselves left only with dispensational scholars to quote in support of a future Antichrist. Yet these partial dispensational futurist pastors are reluctant to quote them, as they have usually dedicated much of their teaching to refuting hardcore dispensationalists on a number of essential doctrines. And quoting reformers and other historicists is out of the question, as their teachings lend absolutely no support for futurism. So the partial dispensationalist futurist pastor is caught between a rock and a hard place. He has no community of scholarship to back up his claims, and therefore rests all his arguments on twisting Scripture to make it say things that aren't there. This is why they ignore the rules of grammar and insert material into verses to make those verses say what they want them to say. And it is why they misapply other scriptures to the scriptures they have twisted, as though that lends credibility to their claims. And it is why they refer to Iranaeus, hoping that most of their followers never study Iranaeus' writings or the history of the early church, as that would expose the Jesuit futurist pastor for the manipulator of both historic commentaries and the very Bible passages that disprove their false doctrines of futurism. Sir Walter Scott said it best when he wrote the following statement that I think applies directly to Jesuit futurist pastors. Quote, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive." Let no Jesuit futurist pastor deceive you by any means, fellow Christians. Read the scriptures for yourself. Study church history and read the writings of the early church leaders for yourself. Check the references that futurist pastors claim support their arguments. Don't take their word for it. Be a diligent Berean. Study to show yourself approved. Thus, Jesuit futurist pastors have no real support in Iranaeus because Iranaeus taught the near dissolution of the Roman Empire, its replacement by Antichrist, a tribulation, and then the second coming, all of which he believed would happen within his lifetime, or shortly thereafter, perhaps by the 3rd or 4th century AD. And Jesuit futurist pastors have no support among the best scholars of Christianity, like Tyndale, Wycliffe, Luther, Melanchthon, Latimer, Huss, Gill, Henry, Cranmer, Calvin, Knox, Hooper, Bullinger, Zwingli, Bunyan, Wiley, Guinness, Eliot, and Spurgeon, and the list goes on. The only place Jesuit futurist pastors can turn for support is among dyed-in-the-wool dispensationalists like Irving, Darby, Schofield, Larkin, and moderns like Walvoord, none of which can hold a candle to the great scholars of the early church or to the reformers and their successors. This presents a great problem for Jesuit futurist pastors that reject the teachings on this subject of the early church leaders and the reformers, and even the very dispensationalists to whom they are most closely related and in agreement with. They end up taking the dogmatic position that they're right and everyone else is wrong. And that is the recipe for a cult. Avoid such pastors, as they insist that everyone who disagrees with them is wrong. That, unfortunately, would have to include nearly all the great scholars of Christianity who disagree with these lone wolf Jesuit futurist pastors. This is the most dangerous kind of pastor. He has no accountability to anyone, is part of no scholarly or theological community, and submits only to his own opinions and imaginations, and to those people he surrounds himself with and who agree with him, or for the most part, don't challenge him in any meaningful way. In closing, if you are under the leadership of such a pastor, be warned, you are in a cult, or at the very least, a cult in the making. Thank you for listening. If you would like to study this further, read my book titled Antichrist, The Smoke of Rome.